Well, welcome to Growth Layer, an interview series that pulls back the curtain on what it takes to actually build and invest in health and family. And today I'm joined by Kerry Rupp, General Partner at True Wealth Ventures, a venture firm built around the belief that women-led companies outperform. Kerry, welcome, and I'm excited to dive in.
Thanks.
So let's start at the beginning. I'd love to hear what inspired the birthing of True Wealth Ventures. Personally, I love the term birthing because I feel like for many of us women, that is our business is another baby and another child. So wanted to, dive deeper into whether it's an original spark or a frustration point that led to True Wealth.
Well, I have to give the credit for that to my business partner, Sarah. But what was so interesting about it, and I'll tell you her backstory, but is that when we met, we were doing a lot of the same things. The overlaps were so many that we almost felt like obligated to actually work together. So Sarah had been an engineer in undergrad and then worked in semiconductors. And almost in her entire career, it was all men. And she didn't really notice because it was so frequent that was the case. So she was working at AMD. And she had worked in venture early in her career, but had gone to AMD to get more operating experience in order to come back to VC and be a more effective venture capitalist. And she was asked to be the executive sponsor of the Women's Forum of this big, global Fortune 100 company, because she was the only woman vice president who had any, operating experience or engineering background. And as a company that was 80% engineers, they really didn't want it to just be an HR or marketing function when, they needed to have credibility with the, women workforce. And that's when she dug into the numbers that showed that when there were more women in senior leadership, companies outperformed. And yet, most companies, it was pretty hard for them to move the needle on, we'll just change the C-suite, over to women and then it'll all work out great. So she, over the course of time, had been thinking about getting back into venture and thought, well, this is a lever that you can, implement immediately. And obviously it's something that resonated with her personally as a woman who had been, in a workforce that was mostly men. And then, there's all kinds of data that shows that women tend to both invest in and start companies that are more aligned to problems that they're trying to solve. And so the, ability to improve health and to improve environmental outcomes really just matched up with the fact that women are actually tending to do things that are more helpful. So I give you all that backstory to say when she started a fund, she realized she hadn't met any women in venture capital, even when she'd been in the Bay Area, working in venture and going to events where there were networking events. And so she started to talk to people in Austin about starting this fund and mentioned that fact. And we were introduced as I was the only other woman in venture in Austin at the time.
Oh my goodness.
Which sounds like hyperbole, but it actually was true. And in fact, for the next several years, we were the only two women general partners in a VC fund in Texas. But the reason for the connection was I had been working as a venture capitalist at Dream Adventures, where we had a startup accelerator and then a venture fund on top of it, and had started a program focused on women-led companies, had started programs focused on health. And so I was doing seed stage or pre-seed even investing, and she was looking at doing seed. And so the overlaps were so many. And so it was a really good alignment between, what she had thought about and what I was already working on. And so there was really a need in the market for it.
And how long did it take some time to get to know each other as partners, as co-founders? How was that synergy and how?
Yeah, no. So it was about 10 and a half years ago because LinkedIn just gave me my, hey, you've been working together for 10 years notice, I think 2 weeks ago. When we met, it was just a lunch. And what was interesting, it was right before the Christmas holidays. And so somehow we actually had some time on our calendar for an extended lunch. So we were just meeting to network because we were, in similar fields. And it was one of those lunches that dragged on for like 3 hours or something because we just had so much to talk about. But at the time I was actually engaged in another role. And so it wasn't like I was planning to join her. I was just planning to help her. And so for a period of time, I was just acting as an advisor. And what happened is that the opportunity was just too great and our synergies were too aligned to not do it. In fact, I think at the time, I really thought I wanted to be an operator again and didn't realize that starting your own venture fund is being an operator. You are a startup founder of a venture capital firm. But I don't think I really fully realized it. And I thought, I know I still want to do startups. I'm not ready to be a venture capitalist because you have to do that for a really long time. The fund life is at least 10 to 12 years, and you're probably not going to just do one fund. And so it's like you decide to do that. You are doing that for, the next couple decades.
Right.
And I didn't fully realize that when you start a venture capital fund, it's a startup, and I was getting to do that. So anyways, I think it took over the course of about 9 months where I was advising her, and then we started talking about maybe being a venture partner, and then realized maybe we should start this thing together and both go in as general partners. And so it was September 10 years ago, so a little bit over 10 years ago, that we decided to start fundraising formally for Friend One.
Wow. Love that. And 9 months is a good period of both dating before you get married.
And it was sort of more of like a courtship, right? Like I didn't know, I was trying not to do it.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah, but it's funny that that's the case because I couldn't love what I do more, and there's just it's such a good fit. So we've been business partners for 10 years, and it really works great.
It looks like your focus on consumer health sustainability that has been consistent. You and I talked a little bit at the meetup a couple weeks ago in terms of the differentiation between really enabling health versus just creating access. So I'd love to hear the focus and your investment thesis, how that has stayed consistent, how that has changed, especially for our listeners.
Yep. So when it started, the primary fundamental thesis is about the gender diverse teams. And that's, predicated on a lot of data that was, relatively new. It started coming out in 2010, I think, or maybe even a little bit before that, but that there were outperformance was visible in companies when there was more diverse leadership team. And that's actually, there's lots of studies, scientific studies that show that diverse teams generally outperform, not just in finance. And they use lots of different factors of diversity, but gender is one that's, sometimes more clear to define than, socioeconomic backgrounds or those kind of things. So, our focus was on women-led teams because the data was like easier to measure there. And there was, out there showing that there'd be outperformance. So that was the first layer of the thesis. So we invest only in companies that have at least one full-time, either C-level woman or founder. And we say full-time because it's about being in the day-to-day operating decisions that we think makes for, the outperformance. And then the other two factors are the companies have to either improve human health outcomes or environmental health outcomes. And when we say improve, we literally mean not be in that sector. So it can't be like something in the healthcare space that's about insurance and it's about making more efficient, payments for your insurance plan. That might be a useful and efficient tool in the healthcare space, but it's not actually directly improving health outcomes. Yeah. So we look for that either in the environmental side or in the health side, that they're actually changing, directly the company is changing outcomes. And I would say that those through lines have been true since the beginning of Fund One. So we started investing in 2016, we got 19 portfolio companies now, and those through lines have always been the same. The one thing that did shift between Fund One and Fund Two, so we raised close to 20 million in between 2016 and 2018, and then we raised another 35 million in 2022. Wow. The thing that we did change was in Fund One, we did have a very explicit consumer-facing strategy saying, hey, not only do women-led companies outperform, but women are making, 80-85% of consumer purchase decisions, and they're also making about 80% of healthcare decisions because they're making healthcare decisions for themselves, their children, their aging parents, and sometimes influencing whether their partner, goes to the doctor. So we thought, well, hey, if women are involved in all those decisions, then we want them actually, we want companies that are, consumer facing because they will bring such an advantage. And it's not that we don't think that's true. It's like, yes, and. So that is true. But also we found that sometimes the business model for a company might make more sense to go B2B. So a lot of times in healthcare, for example, it's, easier if it's being distributed through the pediatrician's office and being, paid for by insurance instead of asking the consumer, trying to get to the consumer directly and having consumer pay. And so it felt somewhat arbitrary to make it be consumer facing in terms of who's paying for it, et cetera. And that we broadened the aperture. So we have more companies in Fund Two that might be B2B, but that the impacts are still around improving health and the environment.
That makes sense.
And that was a lesson, I would say, of seeing companies in Fund One that we had to pass on because they didn't fit what we had told our investors we were going to do. And that's really fundamental to us, is that we weren't going to be like, oh, we changed our minds, we took your money, we're going to go do something different. And so for Fund One, we stayed true to that. But then when we pitched everybody on Fund Two, we said, hey, we think we should open the aperture.
Got it. That makes sense, because I was just about to ask, especially in health, with that B2B versus B2C focus or D2C focus. And, something that I've heard and notice is that some investors only want to focus on B2B because they think that is more sustainable. Acquisition costs have certainly risen over time, especially for D2C companies. And so I'm curious in terms of how you think about that, or what you've seen, with your portfolio companies. It's true that acquisition cost has increased. I'm just curious how you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the business and the value proposition. And a lot of times in healthcare companies, it's parallel paths and or one's first while you wait for
Yes.
something to happen on the other
Yeah.
side. So a lot of times in healthcare, for example, you have the capacity to go to market with a version of your product that doesn't require regulatory FDA processes. And that you could go direct to consumer with that version, but maybe you can't make certain kinds of claims, or it's not quite the regulatory level of product, right? It's a simpler version of the product. And so as a startup company, when funds are so hard to obtain, if you can actually get revenue in the door from some customers while you're actually working on the longer term play, that can be really valuable. Now, there can be times when that can also be distracting and too, lack of focus, right? So sometimes a company will say there is a possibility to go to market direct to consumer, but it's going to be distracting. It's going to take my resources. I'm going to actually just go play the long game and go do the regulatory process. And I think it depends on how strong is the value proposition, how easy is the customer to reach, how expensive is the customer to reach? Is there enough of a viable business there, or should you go, the full business, B2B path? And I don't think they're exclusive, and they don't always go one direction versus the other, et cetera. So
right.
It really does, to some extent, depend on the company and the product solution.
And it also, something that I've heard from founders is how quickly do you want and can you get data? If you can go direct to consumer path, get data, get some learnings, that can be valuable as well. To your point, if it doesn't become a distraction or take away resources from the core business, if you've already established that.
Yeah, and I think that's becoming more and more true. So the data can mean a couple different things in healthcare, right? Sometimes it's just showing, proof of safety or proof of efficacy of the product. But in, a lot of the new algorithm-driven, AI kind of driven solutions, data is actually not just proof that it works, but it's actually part of the product, right? So if you're trying to actually use, algorithms or big data to inform, what the right treatment might be, or to do a better job of a digital diagnostic by having more use cases, data actually drives your product's functionality, doesn't just prove that your product is viable. And so then it becomes more, fundamental to the existence of the company. You need mass volume. And sometimes mass volume can be obtained best through the consumer market, but sometimes it's great to go through a payer or a provider who actually has access, ready access to that, volume.
That's right.
So again, it's not obvious that one path is the right path, just given that, what you're looking for.
Are you seeing any trends between these two paths, even if they're not mutually exclusive, let's say in the last couple of years with your portfolio companies? We see things on the growth and digital marketing side. Just kind of curious what you've been saying.
The hardest part about the B2B pathway is that you cannot predict the timeline.
Yeah.
And you might predict the timeline and find, much like a home construction project, that it's twice as long and costs twice as much.
Great analogy.
Yeah. And so, if you make your business contingent on that and you fund your business to a particular timeline and a certain set of milestones, you can find yourself sort of hanging out on a limb when it takes longer, because they, might have internal priority changes, or there might be new requirements you didn't realize for HIPAA certification or this certification, or you've got to go through this vendor approval process. So there's a lot of things that you can't control. And so that could be hard. And so I think sometimes that being able to go the consumer path gives the entrepreneur some element that they can control, because they can ramp up or ramp down marketing spend. They can make changes on a dime in terms of how they're going to go to market, what they're going to offer, in a way that the B2B companies, they can't drive that as quickly, or as they can't control it.
Yes.
And so, I think there's a balance, but no prescription that says this is what you should do, unfortunately.
I love that. I think oftentimes founders and just people in general, they want a prescription. They want a clear path. Here's what you do to get to X, Y, Z. And I have yet to see that come about, whether you're in the coaching industry or in the health industry. So I love that. Has investing in women and building gender diverse portfolio companies, LP bases, has that Has there been any surprises or unknowns that came about starting from the original thesis of woman-led companies with at least one founder, they've outperformed? Have you found any surprises or in the way you fundraised over time?
I think we would have thought there would have been more change in the data.
Mm.
And so when we started investing in women-led companies, a decade ago, it was about 2% of funding, venture funding, went to companies with women teams. Now that's all women teams, so I can't remember exactly what data point on what year, but let's say it was like 13% of dollars were going to companies with at least one founder at that time. And we had toyed at one point with calling the first fund Gender Matters in order to then go move on to something else by fund two, because it would have been solved, because everyone would have seen the data and everything would
Love the optimism.
Well, it might have been a little extreme. If you followed along with, the pitch book data over time of women founders, it is 10 years later, about 2% of venture dollars go to women-led teams. I think it's more like 20-ish% for gender diverse teams. So there has been some movement there. And I think that is important to note, but it's the investors aren't changing how they invest. And so there's still something fundamental. We could go into all kinds of, debates and deliberations around why that is. And, some of it's like social science and things like that, but it hasn't moved. And so that's frustrating, because when we started, we were, when we raised fund one at 20 million or close to $20 million, we were the first or the largest traditional venture fund ever raised with an explicit gender focus. And while that's like an accolade for us that we were the first, it's also a tiny amount in venture capital. A $20 million fund isn't just micro, it's nano. And so, there was not a lot happening. Since that time, over the last 10 years, there have been a lot more funds that have raised with an explicit gender lens or with women as GPs. And when there are more women in investment decision-making roles at firms, they tend to invest more in women-led founders. So both of those changes in the demographics of this industry should fund more women. But the top line number, really, it's gone down a little bit, gone up a little bit, but it's basically the same. And so that's a surprise and a disappointing surprise, I would say. So, there's a lot of efforts underway to, democratize access to funding and change the way investors make decisions to, look at this as part of their fundraising strategy. I think some of them are working in some ways, but not in aggregate.
Got it.
But I guess to answer one of your other questions in there were there questions about sort of how we fundraise? And that is a pretty interesting one. When we were raising fund one, with this thesis focused on, we think that women-led companies will outperform, therefore we will invest in them. Are you interested in this fund? We did not target women as investors specifically at the outset. Okay. We partly because it was sort of less relevant to us where the money was coming from and more where it was going to. And that's what we were focused on. But also we had gotten feedback that turns out we disagree with, that women are more risk averse, that wealthy women were more interested in their philanthropy, that they weren't going to invest in venture in the same way. And I wouldn't say that we were avoiding women because of that. We just sort of didn't, focus on them specifically. Mm-hmm. And what happens when you raise a fund, you don't raise the entire 20 million all at once. Generally you don't, you do like multiple closes. And so at our first close, 50% of our investors were women. We didn't see it in the data. And when I say women, by the way, I mean the decision maker was a woman. So sometimes it's a couple, right? And so it's a woman and a man, let's say, in a traditional couple. We don't count it as a woman unless it was the woman who was kind of coming to the event, writing the signing the documents, like making the decision. Yeah. So sometimes we'll have a couple and we don't count it as a woman because it was the man and the couple made the decision. So we didn't see the data, but what happened from then is that those women started getting really viral and inviting other women to come see the opportunity because they had not been traditionally invited to be in venture capital funds. Venture capital funds weren't traditionally focusing on women. And these were women a lot of times who had been in the workplace and been, CEOs themselves, or in, other executive roles and known that the women around them and they themselves were capable and effective and that this investment strategy would be viable. And so I think it was a little bit of, if not us, who. And so then what happened is they started being, the ones that were driving our next connections. And then we realized, this is our target market, right? And so we got more specific about, focusing on women as potential investors. But when we closed Fund One, I will say we had a dinner with about 45 people, 43 women and 2 men, that had come, that were investors in our fund. and found out that most of them, like I said, had never been invited to be in a venture capital fund before.
Mm.
And so there's something, and by the way, for those of your audience that don't know, you can't publicly market. So you can't go out and just tell the masses, hey, I'm raising for a fund. Anybody, come invest. Because the government has restrictions around accredited investors and not wanting to solicit someone who isn't in a position to potentially have their money be at risk. So you have to go person by person or through, sort of private channels, et cetera. And so it is an invitation. It isn't just a blanket thing where you can call up and be like, hey, I'd like to be in your fund. And so it requires changing the dynamic of who you network with and how you get connected. And so we really changed that. So for Fund 1, when we closed, we had 80% women LPs, women decision makers.
Wow.
to that.
Yeah.
And that was, according to a Wall Street Journal article when we closed, unprecedented.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone knows for sure because the data of who's invested in a fund is not generally publicly disclosed. But, if not the first or the most, certainly not the norm. And so then when we raised Fund 2, we made a point actually to, again, expose the fund to more women and have it be 80% again.
Yep.
And not because that's fundamental to, who we invest in as women, but because we think women should have access to this asset class. They should be invited. They don't have to invest if they're not interested.
Yes.
So I would say that was also, an interesting change and surprise in, what was happening in the market when we came to market.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful change in outcome. So love that. I guess maybe switching gears a little bit. So you mentioned at the very beginning that you love this work. And I'm curious, between your non-linear path and your training and your background to where you're at now, what you're doing, being an operator, being a founder of a firm, it's a lot of work and it's not for everyone. And so I'm curious for you, what is it that you love about it? And what is it about your path do you suspect has influenced your lens to want to really take this on and create this type of change?
Personally, there are a couple things I think that make it so compelling to me. I mean, the first is you're constantly learning about new things, which is just, from an intellectual curiosity point of view, pretty interesting. So on any given week, we're seeing dozens of new companies. And it's not just a new company, it's not just all... no offense to anyone who's doing B2B SaaS, but it's not just like another software company. It's a new healthcare solution treating a condition that I might not have ever heard of before, and or using a mechanism of action that I wouldn't have known about working, or something in the environment space where there's a environmental challenge that I wasn't even aware of, let's say in the oceans or something like that. And what's fun about it isn't just like, here's a problem. Here's a problem with a potential solution, right? So it's innovative and it's also focusing on the positive forward change. So I would say that's one of the things that's exciting. I think for me and my personality type, and this is just personal, I like to have a variety of things to do. And so while you say maybe sometimes it's too many things to do, but I don't like routine. And so there's not routine. There's nothing routine about the number of things that we have to do at any given time, but also the switching. I've seen a little cartoon where it says like what people think success looks like, and this won't work on the screen because I'll go up and to the right, the wrong direction. But there's like a little chart, and it's like, oh, success, just goes up and to the right. But the entrepreneurial journey, it's like what it really looks like, and it's like this squiggly line that goes up and down and sideways, et cetera. And that is, for better or worse, the real nature of what it's like to run a startup. And so we are generally sitting on the boards of the companies in which we're invested, or at least we're still meeting with the CEO monthly and acting like board members in terms of trying to be helpful on being a sounding board, helping them with hiring, helping them find the next round of funding, digging into their financial model to think about whether the assumptions are right, et cetera. And so we go on those journeys with them, except we don't just have one set of journeys, we have multiple of them in parallel. So there's a lot of change. And so sometimes that can be stressful, but it's also, you need to be resilient. You need to, sort of know that you've just got to like breathe through this and like figure it out because, these waves go in all different directions. But I do think for me that set of different tasks and change and problem solving that happens is compelling. And I think some of that is, when you're figuring out your personality type and what roles are good for you. Some people like the, methodical, like I'm going to do these kinds of things every day. And it's all, sort of like I can plan it out and I know what I'm going to get done. That is not this job.
Before we talk about what's next and what you're envisioning for True Wealth, curious, just going along that thread, was there any childhood influences that you would credit to you taking on, what I think is an incredible mission, right? To enable female founders to really enable health, especially with where the health ecosystem is going and growing. Would you say any childhood influences that has contributed or?
Yeah, I'm not sure specifically to kind of the focus areas. I mean, just because we just followed that thread of, the change every day and the newness and the lack of routine. I did move a lot when I was young. So my dad was in a corporate role that would take us, all over the place for him to, get the next promotion. And literally sometimes like we went from Connecticut to Indiana and then we went to Germany and, we lived in Toronto and not anywhere like super exotic, but we moved around a lot. And so as a kid, before I hit high school, I had moved like 12 times or something like that. And so you get used to seeing new things and expecting change and wanting, sort of like you don't have routine. It also makes you really good at, figuring out how to navigate in a new situation. I feel like I give some of that credit for when I'm at an event and I'm, they're having a reception and you have to go up and talk to strangers and you really just would rather be in your hotel room. Like I'm better at that, I think, because I'm like, oh, here I am again, plopped into a new school, got to make new friends. So I think that maybe is like why the features of the role are relevant. I think that the focus on women and health and the environment, the reason those resonate, sort of happened later in my career.
That makes sense. That makes so much sense between all the moving into childhood and the comfort with change and new exposure. That makes a ton of sense. So what's next? So really a two-part question here. What do you see for True Wealth the next 3, 5, 10 years? I think it's kind of hard to even see 10 years out with the new AI world that we're living in.
Yep.
But like, what's next? And then I'm also curious, like, what's your personal growth layer evolution? Because I believe we're constantly having to evolve. I think even more so today in the last 2 years than ever before.
Well, I guess I'll just for the context, I'm not sure how much the audience knows, but for whatever reason, the traditional way venture capital has worked is you raise a fund and it's a particular pool of capital. And it has the capacity to invest in X number of companies. You define that up front and you have a few years to do that. Of course, those companies are going to need follow-on funding and it's going to take them a while before they either get bought by another company or they IPO, whatever the pathway is. So there's a bunch of activity at the beginning of the fund and you'll continue to do some things, but then once you've picked the companies for that fund, generally you go raise another fund. So that's a second pool of capital, to do the same kinds of things. And in the background, you're kind of helping the companies that you already invested in fund one. But in the new fund, you're finding new companies, doing the due diligence, structuring the deals, et cetera. And those parallel funds can go on for, continue to go on as long as you have like new people in the fund. At some point, Sarah and I are going to have to like retire. And so right now we're on fund two. So we have 12 companies that we invested in at a fund one. A couple of those have exited. The rest are all still operating. And so we're sitting on the boards of some of those. You may know in this external environment, there's not a lot of exits happening. So they're just still operating because our investors would like them to exit so then they can get a return on capital. So we're kind of trying to navigate that. In the meantime, we raised fund two. And we have invested in, I believe, 9 of a planned 15 companies. Okay. And so our current focus is not only helping the existing companies that we've already invested in, but also finding 6 new companies. And that requires seeing dozens and dozens and dozens every week to try to find, let's say 4 to invest in per year. That is kind of our general pace. And sometimes we're slower than that. Because we're, the due diligence is rather intense because we're only going to pick, 15 companies in this portfolio. And we need to have a mix of different kinds of companies at different kinds of stages and different industries that all still fit within our focus of women, improving environment and health, but that are different enough so that you have what you always want in a portfolio, which is just diversification. So we're pretty active in that mode now, which means, going to conferences that focus, generally on these kind of sectors. We don't generally go to like big wide tech conferences, but more ones that are either focused on health or the environment or even women-led companies or women's health. And that's what's taking up a lot of our time. Generally, you would then start thinking about fund 3. And so we're in the planning processes to think about what that looks like. I will say to your point, we really do need to be thoughtful about how AI and the current surge of funding into that sector is changing things. So we are doing a lot of thinking about that. It is possible that the companies that we invest in may be AI users or have AI applications, but most of the fundamental base layer of AI technology and where the billions of dollars are flowing in are to more sort of the baseline, core tech of that industry, which is really happening in other places, not in women-led companies improving health and the environment, right? They might be users of that or, application layers of that. So we really need to think about how might that change? What a fund should look like? Who should be in a fund? What kinds of companies get funded? And I think right now is maybe the messiest time of, the dollars going into AI are huge, which is shrinking the dollars going into other companies, which means our companies are struggling to figure out, how are they going to get funded? So we're kind of watching the landscape right now to figure out, much like we ask our companies to do, which is, customer discovery, to understand where's the pain point, what potential value proposition could you bring to the area. And so we're doing that both from the who are our potential investors and what pain point could we solve for them, but also what pain is there in the market for women-led companies, what challenges do they face, and trying to figure out what the right tool is. And so the right tool might be Fund 3, or it might be something different. And so that's what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, no, it's true. These last couple of years with AI domination has really changed how companies are thinking and using and applying AI. To your point, where are you getting the funding and the investment from? And also just, day-to-day use, growth and marketing as well. So we're in a dynamic landscape.
Yes, totally.
And so I guess maybe ending on that note, what do you see as your personal growth, evolution, and your next layer? Maybe it's tied to all of
Yeah, I think the thing, I was just with some friends from business school this weekend, and one of them had a college-age daughter, and so she's trying to figure out what she's doing with her life, et cetera. And so she's looking to get into maybe a fundraising role in nonprofit. And all of us perked up. Wait, I'm on the board here. I'm on the board here. I'm on the board here. So I'm doing, starting to think about board service. And I have been on the board of a cancer charity in Austin called the Texas 4000, where it's related to UT students who ride their bikes from Austin to Anchorage, Alaska, to raise money for cancer. And I had lost my father to cancer, and also cancer, obviously, healthcare, fits what I'm doing. And one of the things that this team does is create student leaders. And so, future entrepreneurs in some cases. Yeah. So that was my last one. I'm now on the board at Ascension Seton Foundation of Central Texas. They're building a big women's hospital and have a big initiative around women's health. And so that was a nice alignment, given that a number of the companies in our portfolio, because we focus on women and health, we have some women's health. There are areas that I have some insight into, like doulas and other care around pregnancy, like lactation support and nutrition and behavioral health. And then, another company in our portfolio focused on women's health and sort of broader issues. And so I'm looking at where I can, kind of align my nonprofit board service with things where I've got expertise from my role, and then those things can feed each other.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. I loved and enjoyed this conversation, and I can't wait to share it with our community.
Thank you, Destinee.